Sounds
Over to you, Joel.
okay. Wonderful. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, let's dive into it so that we keep on time and have some time for questions at the end. So yeah, there's those couple of key themes we're going to touch on: plant nutrition, as Rob mentioned there, a bit of nitrogen, plant species diversity, and a few kind of grazing-y kind of contexts and things. Okay, so it starts off really, I want to talk about photosynthesis to kind of kick off the lecture. Of course, it's really all about the sun and the sun's energy. It is that energy that comes down from the sun that plants have developed that very unique ability to capture, and using that energy from that sun, breathing in carbon dioxide and driving that photosynthetic process. So, of course, the sun starts the process. It's absolutely key and pivotal. And anything we can do throughout the growing season to capture as much of that sun, be that early on in the season, be that late in the season, the key here is to capture as much of that so that we can use that towards photosynthesis and bringing carbon being the energy, into the system. So, sunlight, that's absolutely critical first step. But then, of course, we also need air, and particularly something from the air, and it's that carbon dioxide, of course, in which the plant can take that relatively inert or unavailable kind of form of carbon and breathe in, and through that process of photosynthesis, fix that into chemical energy, into something more physical, tangible, that glucose molecule, that very first product of photosynthesis, which is really the basis of all life on Earth. But it's not just carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has to combine, of course, with water, H2O. And now we have all of the key ingredients. We have carbon, we have hydrogen, and we have oxygen. And those three combine to form that glucose molecule. So this is that very special process of taking carbon dioxide, gaseous carbon, and turning it into chemical carbon, into energetic carbon, through that process of photosynthesis. But it doesn't just happen like that with the sun, with the energy, with carbon dioxide and water. There's one more key ingredient that we also need, and that is essential macro and micronutrients, and that is the minerals, the inorganic nutrients that often come from the rocks, from parent material, from weathering of parent material, that essentially then come from the soil. So it's also the minerals, the essential nutrients that plants are able to derive, acquire from the soil, which also plays a role in catalyzing or facilitating that process of photosynthesis. So key minerals and nutrients are also very important. And that's the part that we kind of want to have a quick discussion about today. So there's the equation. We want sun, we want energy, we want carbon dioxide, we want water, and we want nutrients, macro and micronutrients. And together, all of these things then drive that process of plant growth, production, biomass production, yield, but also through, of course, all through that process of photosynthesis, in which how the plants derive their energy. Now, when we then break apart and go a little bit deeper into this discussion, which key nutrients are very important? And it starts off with chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the site of photosynthesis. That's why plants are green. This is where they absorb that light energy, and this is where they are able to start this process. And as you can see here, magnesium is a central element in the chlorophyll molecule. So it is a particularly important nutrient that is essential for photosynthesis. And you can also see some nitrogen attached onto that as well. And so, as well as lots of other carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So here we have magnesium being a critically important first nutrient, that is very important, to build the chlorophyll molecule, which is the site of photosynthesis. Now, magnesium is a bit critically important for this reason, but actually only about 15 or 20 or so percent of the magnesium in plants is used. The plant is particularly important for nitrogen utilization and protein synthesis. So a big part of magnesium is used elsewhere, and we're going to talk a little bit about nitrogen shortly, but these are kind of two of its particularly big important functions. So But if we, in the context of photosynthesis, magnesium really is key, being the central ion of that molecule. Now we also need iron, and iron is involved in the synthesis of chlorophyll. Iron is not part of that molecule, but it is part of the enzyme that helps to create it. It is, again, facilitates the synthesis of that chlorophyll molecule. So this is why deficient plants are also classically very yellow, very pale, have a lot of that chlorosis, and that is for the very simple reason that iron helps to make chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is what makes plants green. So that's a key role for iron. Iron is also really important in this discussion of photosynthesis, but it also does other things in plant growth and development, such as helping to use, again, nitrogen. Particularly, it's involved a particular enzyme called nitrite reductase, which is an enzyme that helps to facilitate the utilization of nitrates, which then get converted into nitrite. And then it's this nitrite reductase enzyme that nudges that nitrite along downwards, the metabolic pathway onwards to ammonium. So iron, very important for nitrogen utilization. But iron also plays a very important role for the bacteria in the soil, the nitrogen fixing bacteria particularly. And iron, along with molybdenum, can form that very special molecule called nitrogenase, that enzyme, which is the enzyme that helps to unlock gaseous nitrogen, nitrogen from the air through that process of nitrogen fixation and deliver that N2 gas into the plant in the form of ammonia, which gets very rapidly converted to ammonium. So iron, along with molybdenum, are very important also for bacteria who fix that atmospheric nitrogen, which of course we're all very interested in trying to optimize as much of that free nitrogen as possible as we can, to help us minimize the use of external nitrogen. Okay, then we have manganese, and manganese is also very important for this primary photosynthesis because it's involved with splitting water, the water molecule, liberating the hydrogen and the oxygen. And so it's involved in a special enzyme that facilitates this process. Calcium is also part of this, so calcium is also very important, but perhaps manganese is a little bit more of a leading role in this context, but calcium is also there in that enzyme. So both of them play an important role in helping to split water so that we liberate the hydrogen and oxygen that can then be stitched together with that carbon to build that glucose molecule. And beyond that, manganese does all sorts of other important things like seed development, seed germination, seed maturity, has a lot of kind of important reproductive kind of functions around seed quality, as well as a very important nutrient for plant health. Manganese is well documented to help the plant's plant health against particularly a lot of diseases. And it does that through two mechanisms. One, the facilitation of kind of lignin synthesis, so really toughening up the skin of the plant, but also manganese plays a role in the synthesis of some of the internal systemic biochemicals, kind of defense chemicals that can also help to fight off disease. So manganese does other things, of course, but particularly does also play an important role in direct photosynthesis, along with phosphorus. And phosphorus is just really important because it provides energy. Photosynthetic process, photosynthesis takes a lot of energy, and phosphorus is very important to help deliver some of that energy in the form of ATP. Some of you may remember this one from your high school biology education, adenosine triphosphate. It's that energy currency of the plant. So phosphorus is part of that. But beyond that, of course, phosphorus does, again, lots of other important things like root development, but also helping to accelerate tissue maturity. So just firming up the leaves, particularly against pathogens and things as well. So lots of other things, of course, that it does. So in a quick summary, that's some of the key things along with nitrogen, which help drive this process of photosynthesis. And nitrogen also, as you're all aware, is very important for chlorophyll, but does lots of other things too. And it's part of lots of organic molecules in the plant, like DNA, like other proteins. It does many other important functions, and it, of course, is a very important nutrient to drive yield, to drive production. And that's one of the reasons that we've become very accustomed to use of nitrogen in agriculture. And we're beginning to see some of the negatives of that, of the oversupply, overutilization of nitrogen, where it is also accumulating in the environment and causing some negatives. So it's a double-edged sword. It's one of those very important nutrients that we need to optimize in order for production, but we also have to be very careful about overdoing it in terms of some of the other negatives that come from that. And as I'll talk about briefly now, it's particularly an emphasis on too much nitrogen in relation to other nutrients that work with nitrogen. It's an imbalance of nitrogen in relation to those other nutrients that help nitrogen do what it does. So I'll tease out the nuance of that discussion as we go along. Okay, so in summary then of that kind of opening section here, it's all about driving photosynthesis. That's how plants grow. And yes, it's about carbon dioxide and water, but it is about those essential nutrients that help to catalyze. They're part of enzymes that catalyze this process of stitching together carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen and building that sugar, that glucose molecule, plus oxygen. And if you have a deficiency or a limitation of any one of those key nutrients, like magnesium, nitrogen, iron, manganese, phosphorus, then you're not going to optimize this initial primary photosynthesis. Once we get that building block, that sugar molecule, well, then that becomes the building block of everything else that the plant is made up of and that it requires. So the plant will use that sugar to stitch it together and to form longer chain complex sugars and carbohydrates. It will also plug in some nitrogen and sulfur into that carbon, into that sugar, and rearrange it to build amino acids and to stitch those together to build proteins, and onwards into other things like fats and oils and waxes, like the cuticle layer, other hormones, vitamins, colors, smells, and scents. So volatile organic compounds, flavors, tasty things, as well as then defense chemicals, productive compounds, all sorts of things. So literally everything and anything that the plant is made up of structurally to build its body, or metabolically, some of these internal biochemicals that it uses to grow. These secondary processes are also catalyzed by the essential macro and micronutrients. And if we have a limitation of these, then we don't optimize this process of turning the building block, the sugar molecule, and extracting or utilizing the carbon from that sugar molecule and turning it into all of these other things. So this is where, in the discussion of plant health, plant production, in both of these contexts, it's really about optimizing the nutritional supply, the nutritional content of the plant, making sure that it has all of these macro and micro minerals that will optimize both these primary photosynthesis as well as the secondary processes as well, which are also very important. And we're not going to go through each and every one of these elements. It's just to put them up on screen to say that I've introduced just a handful there, the key ones that play a particular role in primary photosynthesis. But in that secondary process of growth that we see down the bottom here, when we kind of talk about this broader context, I'm talking about all of these nutrients. Every single essential nutrient in various ways, in one way or another, plays these critically important roles in driving plant growth and development. So that's where we need to optimize both the macronutrient supply as well as the micronutrient supply in order to drive plant growth, so that we have the key nutrients to facilitate this process. And of course, it's also important to acknowledge just some of these lesser discussed nutrients, things like molybdenum, cobalt, nickel, are very important for plant growth and often can be deficient, particularly some of these trace minerals. And of course, in a pasture grazing context, we could add all sorts of other things onto this list that have quasi essentiality for plant growth, but clearly are very important for animal function, such as selenium, iodine, for example, some of those other, sodium, of course, some of these other nutrients that play a very important role in animal health as well. And although some plants have an essential requirement for those and some don't, it's kind of a mixed bag, have some kind of middle ground quasi essentiality. Clearly, they still, in terms of nature's design, clearly these minerals were designed to come up into the plant where animals can acquire them through the food that they eat. These important nutrients are much more available, bioavailable for digestion, for absorption in animals or humans when we eat them through the food, as compared to eating them from the soil or in those inorganic forms. So of course, we could extend this list, this basic kind of list that I have here, beyond that into some of those other important nutrients that are really important for animals too. So let's take a little deep dive just quickly in the context, a bit of a case study of nitrogen. And when we think about the plant acquiring nutrients from the soil, taking up various nutrients, it will take up those nutrients and then, of course, use them to grow, to build all sorts of organic molecules, things that help them function. And in the context of nitrogen, the plant really wants to turn all of the nitrogen that it takes up from the soil, particularly these inorganic forms like nitrate or ammonium. Urea is technically an organic form of nitrogen, but it takes these nitrogen forms up. They are essentially the building blocks, and the plant really wants to turn them into much more useful compounds like organic molecules, like amino acids, particularly, and onwards into other things like proteins, like that chlorophyll we talked about, or the DNA, etc., etc. These are the compounds over here on the right-hand side. They are the ones that have really important function for the plant. They are very versatile. They drive reactions. They are very useful. Coming back here to things like nitrates or ammonium, they play somewhat of a role in terms of being signaling molecules and sending messages to the plant about its overall nutrient status, which helps it in all sorts of important ways. But ultimately, these are really just building blocks. The plant acquires them with the goal of turning them into these other more functional and useful organic molecules like amino acids, and particularly onwards into all these other things like proteins, etc. So in the context of nitrogen, here's how the plant utilizes them. It might take up nitrates, it will convert that to nitrites and onwards to ammonium. Urea is taken up, also converted to ammonium, and then ammonium is converted to amino acids and onwards to proteins. And I put this slide up here also just to illustrate that as farmers, you all appreciate the value of protein, be that protein in grain for human health or in forage and feed for animal health. We all appreciate the value, the quality enhancing value of high protein feed and food. But in order to get that, it's not just about applying nitrogen or having nitrogen in the system or making sure that nitrogen is available. Nitrogen is not an island, and it needs other nutrients to work with it. And that's where we add this extra layer of detail onto the slide. So you can see here now we have all sorts of other nutrients in the red boxes. And what we're illustrating here is that in order to convert that, for example, nitrate, along this metabolic pathway, we need things like molybdenum, like sulfur, like iron. These are key nutrients that facilitate the conversion. And if we have a limitation or deficiency of these, we will not be able to nudge that nitrate along. Similarly with urea, it requires nickel. Nickel is a heavy metal. We have to be careful about it, but it's also an essential nutrient that helps to facilitate the utilization of urea and nudge it along this pathway. Then we also need manganese, magnesium to move ammonium along into the organic form, into these amino acids. Particularly glutamine is the first one here that's synthesized. And then from there, the plant begins to stitch together lots of amino acids to build protein. And it does utilize lots of other nutrients for this process. Particularly the top three here, phosphorus, sulfur, and magnesium are very, very important for protein synthesis. But also these other ones play a role: manganese, boron, potassium, and zinc as examples. So that is just pointing out that No nutrient is an island, especially nitrogen. It actually requires these other essential nutrients, particularly a lot of trace minerals you can see there, and some other macro minerals, which are involved in working with that nitrogen, helping to convert that nitrogen into these original forms that are taken up and onwards into the much more useful and functional forms like amino acids and beyond into those proteins. So this is the point to emphasize the importance of plant nutrition. It's not just important for primary photosynthesis, like the example we just shared at the beginning of the lecture. It moves on into these secondary processes where then the plant also then has to take that carbon and ultimately use it to build all sorts of other things. And again, it requires these other critical nutrients involved in that process. So that leads us into then this discussion about nitrogen use efficiency. And I want to kind of tease out two different definitions of nitrogen use efficiency. We're going to start with the first one, and we'll come back to the second one. The first one is the classic definition of nitrogen use efficiency, which is really should be more specifically termed nitrogen uptake efficiency. And this is really defined as the amount of nitrogen that we get into plants based on relative to how much we applied. So of the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that I applied, how much of that got into the plant? And that's that kind of classic definition of nitrogen use efficiency. And that's important, obviously, to minimize the losses and therefore to be efficient, not waste money, not waste inputs, and optimize as much coming into the plant, minimizing the losses. So that's where I'm going to start, and we're going to come back to talk about the second definition, which is the nitrogen utilization efficiency, which is about how plants use nitrogen once it gets into the plant. So we'll come back to that one in a second. Now, starting off with uptake efficiency, the uptake efficiency is just really pointing out that there is this nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is a very reactive nutrient. It likes to exist in all sorts of different forms. It likes to exist in soils, in water, in the air, in gaseous forms, in soluble forms. It's a very reactive nutrient, and that presents a lot of challenges with its management because it's very, very leaky. It can easily off-gas as volatilization, off-gassing as ammonia, for example. It can also off-gas as nitrous oxides. We can often apply to that to try and rebalance that, to re-enter nitrogen into the system, but we also have offtake, of course, through harvest. This is something that we can't help, of course, but what we really want to focus on is trying to minimize some of these off-gassing losses, as well as then the leaching, the nitrate losses that can also move down the soil into our waterways, etc. So it's really about trying to balance nitrogen storage, nitrogen cycling. Nitrogen has this tendency to go up and down, either up into the air or down into the waterways. And what we want to really focus on is the cycling, the storage and the cycling of that nitrogen down in that soil, in that root zone. And that's the kind of the key piece that we want to optimize in order to minimize the losses and optimize the uptake, and therefore improve those efficiencies. And that's really the goal of the discussion about nutrient use efficiencies, is that when we apply fertilizers down into the soil, soils are very prone to these losses and these antagonisms. Nutrients can either, in that example of nitrogen, be lost, literally leaking or off-gassing out into the environment, or they can lock up and become unavailable to the plant. So nitrogen is that one that's very prone to the losses. So as you can see here, we have often hovering around about 50% use efficiency. So that means really about 50% of what we apply ends up in the plant. The other 50% is not to say that it's lost. Some of it can be stored in the soil organic matter, stored in the soil organisms, etc. But it is potentially also prone to those losses. But that's a bit different from something like phosphorus, which also has a very low efficiency. But phosphorus it's just that phosphorus has this very strong tendency to lock up, bind to other things, other nutrients, and become unavailable. And so this kind of image, this table you see here, is really pointing out how inefficient fertilizers and nutrients can become when we apply them to the soil, because they are prone to these lockups and antagonisms and losses. And therefore, this opens up these inefficiencies with fertilizer use. And this is a big problem facing agriculture, something that we very much need to address. And nitrogen, again, coming back to nitrogen, just as a bit of a case study through this lecture, it's just particularly concerning, as I already emphasized, because of this reactive nature. It is easily lost into the system, but when we have too much nitrogen in the system, this actually undermines plant health. So we begin to actually compromise plant health. We begin to see loss of biodiversity, because plants will begin to die out if they have an excess of nitrogen, and or some plants begin to compete and dominate those plants that like the excess nitrogen. So these things can combine to lead to biodiversity loss. Excess nitrogen can both build soil organic matter, but also burn it. It's a little bit of both here. So it can lead, when over applied, it can lead to greater carbon fluxes and greater contribution of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, those nitrous oxides, up into the atmosphere. And as we talked about, leaching nitrates down into the waterways. This can contaminate waterways, river systems, algal blooms, and this is also a problem for human health and our drinking water. You're all aware that when we apply nitrogen to legumes, it will actually suppress the nitrogen fixation potential of the rhizobium with those legumes. The legumes won't facilitate or support those rhizobium. And the same is true when we widen that lens to talk and look at other nitrogen fixing bacteria. There are lots of other bacteria in soils beyond rhizobium who also fix nitrogen, and these organisms, these bacteria, they associate with grasses, with cereals, with oilseeds, with all sorts of other plants. These are called associative nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they will crowd around the root system, live in that rhizosphere, maybe even in the root system, or endophytes in the plant, where they can also fix nitrogen. And this study here that I have on screen is really just pointing out that the same response is true. When we over-apply nitrogen inputs into the system, we also suppress these other associative nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So it's not just rhizobium who are suppressed, it's also some of these other free-living types. So the very process that we want to enhance and maximize to get free nitrogen out of the air, free nitrogen into the system, to minimize our dependency and our input costs, we are undermining this process when we do apply nitrogen, particularly excessive nitrogen. Now, some nitrogen application is okay in the soil. It's not going to cause huge problems, but it is particularly once we move up into some of the higher doses and over application that it becomes a lot more problematic. Small amounts, I would argue, can be very beneficial, just to kind of prime and drive the system, a bit of kind of energy for biology to drive the system.
We'll hold our nerve and hope that he connects back up in a second. The Southern Hemisphere, Western Australia, internet. I think that looks like Joel has left the webinar. It's going so well as well, wasn't it? Let's hopefully he'll realise and reconnect in a moment. If anybody's got any questions that come to mind, feel free to put them in the chat. And hopefully we'll get him back in a minute. Just while we're waiting, I will. Oh, here we go. He's back in the waiting room. Ruth, can you?
Okay, I also cut out.
You did cut out.
Whereabouts I cut out?
On the slide you had open, you just came into it. If you share your screen, that's right. You just came into it, and then you pretty much froze as you just made a start on that slide, Joel.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here I was sharing a study from Roth highlighting the also some of the negative effects of nitrogen on plant species diversity. Here we have the control on the left-hand side. So we have a lack of nitrogen fertilization, where you can see a lot of plant species diversity in these pastures. But once we begin to fertilize those pastures, you can see that the grasses begin to particularly dominate and some of the other species get smothered out. So here I'm just sharing an example of even within an agricultural context whereby we are losing plant species diversity through the enrichment of that nitrogen. And of course, often it's the legumes that are dying out, as an example, and they're the ones that are going to fix that nitrogen. So here, just a nice example of some of the negatives on plant species diversity as well. Now, in the context of a pasture, and this is also true in cropping, but it is not quite as efficient or as plentiful as what we see in cropping as we do see in pastures, is that legumes do share nitrogen with non-legumes in real time in the current growing season. It's not just when they die and decay in which they release that nitrogen. Whilst legumes and non-legumes are growing together in a diverse system, in a companion planted system or a multi-species pasture, those legumes are sharing nitrogen with the non-legumes. And they do this, yes, primarily through their death and decay, but these other two real-time pathways is evident through root exudation. So when we talk about root exudates, we often talk about plants releasing sugars and carbohydrates down into the roots, but plants release all sorts of other compounds, including organic acids and also amino acids. And amino acids are organic forms of nitrogen. So when the plant releases amino acids, organic nitrogen, when the legume releases those, the non-legume, if its root systems are intermingled in a more diverse, multi-planted polyculture type system, then the nitrogen-hungry cereal or nitrogen-hungry grass or oilseed will scavenge some of those amino acids from the root zone where the legume is pumping them out. So we have literally a scavenging or stealing of nitrogen from the legumes by the non-legumes. So that's one pathway, but on top of that, we also have direct transfer through mycorrhizal fungi. And that's only if the two plants are both mycorrhizal associative, then through this, what's called the common mycorrhizal network, legumes will share nitrogen through the mycorrhizal bridge and deliver that nitrogen to the non-legume. So we do see this resource sharing, and this is very prominent in a classic kind of grass clover pasture and onwards into the other multi-species pastures where those legumes are sharing nitrogen with the non-legumes and driving production increases. So they can also do it in real time. And here's a really nice study that was exploring exactly this, looking at some of the grass legume mixtures and how they can yield more nitrogen in the system even than a pure legume stand. And I'm just going to read you these highlights on the right-hand side. You can come back and watch this and pause and read the full abstract if you'd like to, or find the paper down here. You'll find, if you just punch in this number down here online, you'll find the paper if you want to read this one. But here they're looking at growing and comparing a mixed grass legumes with those mono legumes. And I'll just read you a few highlights here. We describe how the legume proportion modifies the nitrogen acquisition from different sources. So increasing the legume ultimately helps to increase nitrogen access. But this was done they demonstrated here quite interestingly that it was the symbiotic nitrogen fixation from the legumes that was stimulated or enhanced in the mixtures as compared to the monocultures. And this is kind of interesting context where, sorry, I want to go back here. When we have a mixture of clover, or in this example, a legume and a grass, you have a very nitrogen hungry plant here, over here, the non-legume. And so when it constantly is depleting the nitrogen from the root system of that legume, the nitrogen never builds up around the root system of the legume. And it is that nitrogen that builds up around the root system that is the trigger to turn nitrogen fixation off. So particularly nitrate here is a signaling molecule that when nitrate builds up in the soil around a legume, that sends a signal to the legume that says, you don't need to keep on feeding the rhizobium. You don't need to keep nitrogen fixation on. You have enough nitrogen around you to finish your development, finish your growth cycle, so you can stop feeding them. So the legumes will slow down on N fixation. But when you have a nitrogen-hungry scavenger nearby constantly uptaking and depleting that soil nitrogen remains low, so therefore the trigger never gets sent to the legume, so it keeps on feeding the bacteria and it keeps on fixing more nitrogen. So legumes will fix more nitrogen in a companion context than they will in a monoculture because of that mechanism. So that's really what this also demonstrated. But on top of this, they also showed that then uptake from the soil nitrogen supply, so this is not from N fixation, but the rest of the soil mineral nitrogen that was existing in the soil, that they also showed that the nitrogen uptake from those pools was also stimulated in the mixtures from the monocultures. So the mixtures were better able to also acquire nitrogen from the soil. And both of these two processes, enhancing N fixation as well as enhanced nitrogen acquisition from the soil, ultimately, once then that nitrogen entered the plant, that acquired nitrogen was ultimately then used more efficiently by the mixtures for biomass production. So meaning that of the nitrogen that they acquired, the mixture versus the monoculture was able to produce more biomass per unit of nitrogen acquired. And so that leads us into the second definition of nitrogen use efficiency, which is the nitrogen utilization efficiency. And that is defined as how much biomass or how much yield, depending on the context, how much yield are we able to build, are we able to produce per unit of nitrogen that's in the plant. So really reflecting the plant's ability to use the nitrogen that it acquires and turn it into biomass. And in order to answer that question, we then have to unpack the different forms of nitrogen and the efficiency of those forms of nitrogen. And I've talked about this in length in other lectures. And so for people that kind of want to dive into this, you'll find some stuff on YouTube. If you do some Googling there, you'll hear me kind of dive deeper into this. I'm just going to summarize it for brevity of time. Already I see we're cracking on with time. So it's just to say that when we feed the plant more of these organic forms on the right-hand side, which are further up the metabolic pathway, these are more efficient forms because the plant doesn't have to expend energy to convert these lower forms. So yes, these are useful and they are the building blocks as we talked about earlier, but they cost the plant a lot of energy to turn that nitrate into ammonium and then to turn that ammonium into amino acids. It costs the plant energy to move nitrogen along this pathway. And if we were to then supply nitrogen more in these organic forms already further up the pathway, the essence of the point is we're saving energy, wasting energy on processing these inorganic forms because these inorganic forms are very metabolically expensive for the plant to utilize. So that's really the essence of the nitrogen utilization efficiency. If we can deliver more organic forms, these cost the plant less energy and therefore they can improve production. And this essentially is called metabolic shortcutting. It just says rather than deliver to the plant the inorganic forms, which is that classic view of plant nutrition, we've been very focused on those inorganic forms and their role in driving plant growth in agricultural contexts. But actually, if we widen that lens, we realize, well, plants can and do take up these organic forms like amino acids, like small chains of amino acids called peptides, or larger chains of amino acids called proteins. The plant can take up all of these larger, more complex organic forms. And because they are already organic, they are shortcutting that metabolic pathway and saving the plant's energy. And that's the essence. What if we just give these plants these organic forms? Then they can actually save energy and produce more biomass with those. So the key message here is that we have to graduate and move beyond that basic idea that primarily inorganic forms of nitrogen are used by the plants This may well be true in agricultural contexts because we primarily apply organic forms. But if we look into the ecological literature and look at plants in native ecosystems, etc., they are predominantly using more of these organic forms because those are more prevalent in those natural systems. They still use some inorganic forms as well, of course, there's a mixture of both, but it's just to say that in natural systems, you find a kind of the nitrogen forms lean a little bit this way. In agricultural contexts, they lean a little bit towards the inorganic forms because primarily that's what we deliver. But beyond both of these, of course, then we have biological forms of nutrients. I'm sure many of you come across the rhizophagy cycle, and this is also one step further, highlighting that plants can even take up and absorb whole bacteria and engulf those, internalize those into their root system, where they can strip nutrients out of the cell walls, etc. So nitrogen is much more than just nitrate, ammonium, and urea. It extends into these organic forms. It extends into these biological forms like microorganisms that can also be a source of nutrients. So it's much more complex than that basic view that we have. And that's then where the discussion around foliars becomes also an interesting point here. This is just to say that, yes, in nature, plants do absorb nutrients through their leaves. It is a natural thing, and it is a process that we can potentially enhance through agricultural systems. So, of course, kelp and seaweed and other aquatic plants, they take nutrients up through their leaves. We have examples in the literature of dust. So dust that is deposited on the leaf can be a source of nutrients. The plant can actually excrete organic acids onto the leaf, where it will strip and solubilize nutrients out of the dust, particularly phosphorus. Meaningful amounts of phosphorus have been demonstrated to be absorbed out of dust, which can improve plant growth. And then we have things like urine or animal feces as organic forms of nitrogen that can be taken up through the leaf. We have great examples of this in the literature, and even fog. Fog also contains ammonia gas, which has also been demonstrated to be absorbed through the leaf. So yes, in nature, plants take up nutrients through the leaves, and this is something that we can also optimize through our agricultural production systems. And the best forms of nitrogen to do this are urea and amino acids. And that's because both of these two things are carbon-based forms of nitrogen. They are organic forms of nitrogen. Now, of course, urea is not a certified organic input. It is an organic molecule. It contains carbon. It is synthetically manufactured, of course, and it has a high energetic cost associated with that, which we can have that discussion about the sustainability of that. But in terms of the molecule itself, it is an organic molecule. It has carbon embedded, and that actually makes it a very favorable form of plants, of nitrogen for plants to use, primarily, or when it is predominantly when it is applied through the leaf. Because when we put that urea in the soil, that organic fraction of nitrogen in the soil, it doesn't remain as urea. It breaks down back into those inorganic forms like ammonium and nitrate, which then are less efficient because they're further down that pathway. So urea and amino acids are very favorable forms to be taken up through the leaf because they are carbon-based. And as you can see, that they are taken up very rapidly. Here we're looking at urea uptake and across time, and you can see how quickly urea is taken up through the leaf, literally within a few hours. Same with amino acids here that were applied within a few hours. So these are the very efficient forms. That means that we can get nitrogen into the plant to drive production, but minimizing the amount that enters the soil, which causes some of those losses and those inefficiencies that we were also talking about. But key to that is stabilizing nitrogen inputs with carbon. You want to make them organic-like, mimic organic molecules by binding inorganic nutrients with carbon. Carbon acts like a sponge and it binds to it. And this kind of molecule, this chelate or this complex, is then much more stable and therefore much more effectively absorbed both through the leaf and or through the soil. So the idea of integrated nutrient management using organic amendments, composts, manures with artificial fertilizers is a good middle ground, a good balance for those of you that are not certified organic, so to speak. There is a best of both worlds if we can kind of combine carbon with nutrients to help stabilize them. And even then in a liquid or foliar context or around a seed treatment, if you're doing any pasture renovation, or for those of you who are mixed and do some arable, we can also use these other kind of carbon sources blended in with our coated on our granular fertilizers or solubilized in liquid form with liquid inject.
No, Joel again.
Here
Oh, he's back.
to bind nutrients.
You did drop
Okay,
out,
so
Joel.
where did I drop out? Where did I drop out?
Only just, but perhaps if you turn your camera, it's a brilliant connection apart from when you drop out. Perhaps if you turn your camera off, that might just help.
Sure.
Keep it.
Sure.
Keep it going.
I can do that.
Only just a few seconds earlier, Joel.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I was just highlighting that some of these carbon inputs in a liquid form can also be used to either coat fertilizer granules or mixed with liquid nutrients to be applied to the foliar, where they act like a sponge and bind to the nutrients to kind of stabilize those, but also improve uptake. These carbon-based molecules are more effectively taken up through the leaf, and that's exactly why urea and amino acids are very rapidly taken up through the leaf, is because they are carbon-based. They are organic molecules, and that's the premise of what we're trying to replicate by adding these types of additives with synthetic nutrients to kind of turn them more into an organic form, carbon-based form, where they are more stable, less leaky, but also more efficient for uptake. Now, I see I'm getting very close on time. Sorry, I'm going to brush through these last bits. I just wanted to then extend the discussion into plant species diversity and say that, okay, yes, we've got to optimize nutrition for growth, but then if we can optimize plant species diversity, this also helps us to utilize different plant species, different specializations, different unique advantages and things that they have. And as you can see, different rooting traits and characteristics, better utilization of the nutrients from the soil. So I've kind of had a bit of a conversation about adding fertilizers, adding nutrients in the least harmful way, in the most optimized way. But of course, down in the soil, particularly if you have reasonable depth of soil, you have a lot of nutrients present in the soil already. And you may not also, particularly in a perennial pasture-based system, for those of you that are, you may not even have to be adding any at all. You just might need a bit greater diversity of plants and root systems to get down and access those nutrients along and down that profile and acquire those nutrients and cycle them up and bring them up towards production for photosynthesis, for driving plant growth, for animal nutrition, etc. So it's also about species diversity to leverage the fertility that is already there in your soils, and diverse plants can really help to do that. But of course, it's also about combining plants with grazing, with animals. And it is that combination of pastures, perennial pastures particularly, and the impact of the animal, which come together to graze and eat and cycle through the rumen and deposit in manure, that helps to drive some of these carbon cycling interactions that can also help to drive changes in soil health, nutrient cycling, soil carbon, etc. And here's a really nice study. This was out of the US on a more sandy soil, so fine, you can take it a little bit with a grain of salt, but it's an interesting study that highlighted the negatives of excluding animals, where we had a pasture, split it in half. On one half we just cut and mowed, the other half we included the animals and grazed those animals through that pasture. And they found here in the study is that where they excluded the animals, so where they cut and mowed, this was associated with less carbon, below ground carbon allocation. That meant less root biomass, that meant less root exudation, that meant less microbes growing, feeding off those carbon inputs, so less microbial biomass. And all of these things ultimately led to lower soil organic carbon. So even though the pastures were the same, they were both being cut, one with the animal's teeth and its hoofs and its pulling and tugging and saliva and all of that interaction, versus just cutting with a blade. Something about the animal inclusion there was stimulating more below ground activity, root activity, which ultimately drives more soil carbon. Here we have a very recent study just from earlier this year from the UK. Here we're looking at also the cessation or the ceasing and stopping of grazing causing biodiversity loss amongst below ground soil food webs. So here they showed that cessation of grazing led to strongly decreased alpha diversity of most groups of the soil microbes and some of the soil fauna, particularly among some of the rare taxa. Their results here indicate that exclusion of domestic herbivores from historically grazed montane or more mountainous hillside grasslands has far-ranging negative consequences for the diversity of those below-ground food webs. And this underscores the importance of grazers for maintaining the diversity of below-ground communities, which play a central role in ecosystem functioning. So here we're highlighting some of the negative consequences of removing animals also from the soil biodiversity point of view. And really, okay, a picture says 1,000 words. You can also kind of understand and grasp the benefits of that diversity. It's about different plants with different specializations, doing different things, different rooting depths, accessing different nutrients, moisture from shallow or deeper. Then they're accumulating those minerals, bringing them up into the plant. We have more diverse diet for the livestock. We have different plants. Leaf growth habits, so above ground architecture, capturing that sunlight, using those nutrients to drive photosynthesis, different flowering times, supporting different beneficial insects across a wider spectrum of the growing season as compared to our, for example, monoculture on the left-hand side. That's, yeah, sure, it's when it's on and flowering, it's fantastic and the bees are happy, but what's happening just before that? What's happening just after flowering? So you have these very boom and bust kind of cycles, whereas on the right side we have lots of continued flowering across the year, supporting more ecology, but also different plants, maybe cooler season, warmer season, early season, late season. So we're just really harnessing the acquisition of resources, be that sunlight, be that soil moisture, soil nutrients, to optimize production through that growing season. And that's really the essence of that diversity. And a big part of that is, coming back to this, a big part of this is that these plants have an increased ability to, because of the different leaf architectures, shoot architectures, they are better able to capture sunlight and therefore use that sunlight to photosynthesis, therefore in order to breathe in more carbon dioxide to drive photosynthesis. And that's what this study was showing, which was really interesting. We're comparing a monoculture mustard with a 4-way mix and a 12-way mix. And I just want to cut to the chase here on this one. They did this in a growth chamber. It's a lab study where they did this in a growth chamber where they measured the CO2 depletion from the mono to the 4 to the 12-way mix. And they show here that the CO2 uptake was in that 4-way mix was 2 times higher. So 2 times more CO2 uptake in the 4-way mix and 3 times higher CO2 uptake in the 12-way mix. So you can see here, this is a key part of the mechanism by which diversity can improve the system performance, can improve soil health, soil carbon, soil function, soil biodiversity. It's because the plants are better able to breathe in more carbon dioxide, to get more carbon fixed out of the air into the system, where then that carbon will be deposited down into the soil to drive all those changes. So in a way, it comes back to this as a key first step when we talk about the benefits of diversity. It's really about their ability to acquire more CO2, therefore acquire more food, more energy, to then drive changes below ground in the system. So that's a key kind of advantage. And I'm going to skip through these studies because I see I'm going over time. So this was just to share 2 studies that show that when you enhance CO2 uptake and you put more carbon down into the soil, that leads to greater soil organic matter accrual, greater soil carbon sequestration. And that's what this study highlights here. They found with greater plant species diversity, more above ground biomass, more below ground biomass, more total biomass, more soil organic carbon. So yes, diversity helps then build soil organic carbon. Here's another study that showed exactly the same thing, again in grasslands, where restoring soil plant species diversity increased soil carbon. And you're looking here at, I know it's a busy slide, at 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16 species plots. And as you can see, the 16 species plots, which are all the red ones, always are accruing higher soil carbon, root carbon storage, soil carbon storage, but also through time, you can see that there's greater carbon accrual. The red is always on the top, as you can see pretty much in all of these graphs. So the 16 species plots always accrued more carbon in the roots, in the soil, and over time. So yes, diversity also helps to build soil carbon, and it also helps to increase drought resilience. And I know you folks have had a very wet winter, but you have had quite a few dry summers in the past recent years, in the last 5 years or so, as has a lot of Europe. And we also have good studies that show that more diverse plant species also increase their water use efficiency and drought tolerance. Just for time, I don't want to dwell on this, but it's just to say that really by using different plants, you're optimizing, or you're harnessing the different specializations of those different plants to tolerate different soil moisture conditions. Some plants are very good at optimizing production early on in the drought phase because they're very good at avoiding dehydration. They're very good at holding on to moisture, but their efficiency in doing that declines over time as the soil gets drier and drier. But you have other plants that then are just better at growing in those dry conditions, and they can maintain productivity later on. So for example, let's use this example, this little triangle here. If you had a monoculture of this plant species, you would have really good production early on in that drying soil, but then it would completely decline to nothing. And if you had a monoculture, by the end, you would have nothing. But by having another plant species there that can still maintain some growth and some production later on in that dry soil, you're able to then fill that niche and get some biomass production later on. And so just in a simplified example there with 2 plant species, that's what you can optimize with more diverse plants, tolerating different, occupying different niches, both spatial but temporal, and optimizing production throughout that drying soil. So even in drought context, diversity also helps. Okay, I'm sorry I went a bit over time. I hope you've got time to stick around and have a few quick questions. In conclusion, plant nutrition, yes, it's very, very important to drive photosynthesis, to get that initial carbon into the system. If you don't have nutrients for the plants, they can't get that carbon in efficiently. Nitrogen, of course, is a very important nutrient that drives yield and production. We all know it's very important, but it is not an island. You've got to pair that up with some of those other essential nutrients, like those trace minerals we talked about, molybdenum, iron, nickel, boron, manganese, zinc, for example. They all play a role in nitrogen utilization. Foliars can also help to just boost production without building up some of those soil excesses, which is where most of the losses come from. The leaching, the off-gassing, that predominantly happens from the soil. Now, and I'm not saying that therefore we can completely avoid nutrients in the soil. Soils are also designed for nutrient uptake through the roots, so we want some in there, some is okay. It's just this nuance about too much. It's about this lack of synchronization of supply and demand of what the plant requires. So that's where foliars can play a role, just to try and top up plant growth in high demand times, but also minimizing the nutrition enrichment of the soil, which can lead to some of those losses. Now, for those of you who are pasture-based, you have a very lucky advantage. I think animals plus pastures are the ultimate soil health improvers. It is through that grazing interaction of the animal, the pasture, the hoof, the manure, the urine, the tugging, the saliva, the ripping, the grazing, the teeth. There is something in that interaction that absolutely drives soil organic matter formation. As we all know, that pastures have much more soil carbon than arable systems. And then adding that layer on top of that, diverse pastures can also bring many other benefits, including deeper roots, better resource use efficiency, be that moisture, be that nutrients, better CO2 utilization, higher photosynthetic rates, and better nutritional value for the animals, et cetera, and better soil carbon accrual. So I think the diverse pasture context and discussion is also very valid, and great to see that we're all moving down this path these days. So, okay, we got there. Let's open up to some questions if there is some.
There sure is. Thank you, Joel. Like thought-provoking as expected, really, and reassuring to hear about herbivores and diversity and how important they are. So yeah, really good. We've got a few questions we'll zip through. So starting off with Kate, coming back really to the resource sharing thing, which I think hit a nerve with a lot of us. So Kate's put, so presumably brassicas wouldn't benefit from the mycorrhizal bridge if planted with legumes.
Correct. That is correct. Yep. Other plants will, but brassicas will not, and other non-mycorrhizal plants will not. But that's not to say that those plants cannot still benefit through the sharing of the root exudates through that pathway. So if there's close root intermingling of a legume and a brassica, then any of those amino acids that the legume is pumping out can be scavenged by the brassicas. So you can still have resource sharing through other mechanisms, but just not through that mycorrhizal pathway. Correct.
Okay, and following on from that, Anna's asked, can the inorganic compounds transfer also take place between legumes and trees, e.g. perhaps a tree nursery or an agroforestry setup?
Yes, for sure. So again, so the key here is either root intermingling or that they're both mycorrhizal associated, and providing there's either that close contact or that mycorrhizal association, be that any plants, be that shrubs, trees, through to annuals, etc., that yes, as long as they are connected through that mycorrhizal network, that common mycorrhizal network, or that they have intermingling roots, then yes, there can be the potential of that nutrient sharing. Yeah.
Thank you. Paul's put quite a wordy question. I'm going to have to sort of get my eye in. How much N can be supplied to the crop as carbon sources, e.g. humic and fulvic acids? Grasses, herbs, legumes can have a potentially very large N demand of 100 to 130 kilograms per N hectare or more. So he's asked to put that as an add-on. So yeah, how much N can be supplied to the crop as carbon sources, e.g. humic and fulvic acids?
Good question. In natural ecosystems, of course, it is predominantly supplied in these organic forms. So it is, of course, possible to supply enough to plants for them to complete their life cycles. I think in an agricultural context, however, where we are demanding a lot higher production, a lot higher output than maybe of what is expected of a natural ecosystem, it becomes much harder, which is the essence of your question. And I think that really it is theoretically able to supply all of the plant requirements via organic forms. Yes, you could do it, but the economics of that wouldn't stack up. So you would find that the cost per unit of nitrogen of some of those organic forms, like amino acids, etc., is much, much higher than the cost per unit of, say, urea or ammonium nitrate, etc. So it's the economics really that would dictate the answer to your question. And theoretically, you can supply 100%, yes. And there are some examples of this happening. I think we're learning anecdotally what's possible in this space. It's still an emerging and unknown kind of question. But I think that for now, I would say comfortably that the practical outcome of your question is that the goal then is to supply at least some organic forms along with those inorganic forms to try and get a mixture of both. And that there are a lot of advantages if you can just try and get a bit of a better balance between the two. But I would also stress that I know for those of you who are organic who can't use urea, but urea as a foliar is an organic form. It is carbon-based. It has a lot of efficiency gains that come with it. So I think that urea is a very special case study when used as a foliar. Even though it's a synthetic form, it has a lot of advantages. As soon as you put that urea in the soil, though, very different animal. It behaves very, very differently. So I think that urea is a kind of a special example where it's more aligned to your question, that you could be supplying a lot of the plant nitrogen form in these more organic forms.
Thanks, Joel. Sarah has answered Kate's questions about the study sources, and they're in the chat, so do follow your nose to the chat quickly and uplift those everybody. I'll just answer Barnes's question about where we're going to host this. So the recording will go onto the Pasture for Life YouTube channel, and we'll also put a link into the next Pasture for Life newsletter so people can pick it up from there. So you'll be able to go back to look at this, as Joel suggested, to slow it down and read things in detail. Okay. James is jumping on Paul's question to add to Paul's question, how much foliar N can be added in a singular pass to humic fulvic source as a fertilizer source? Does that make sense? So to add to Paul's question, how much foliar N can be added in a singular pass to humic or fulvic source as a fertilizer source? Are you there, James? Do you want to come in and ask it? Am I not asking it quite right? Are you there, James?
I think I do understand the essence of the question, but James, if you do want to jump in and say something, feel free. Oh, I can see you're unmuted.
Go on, James.
Yeah, go on. No, he's unmuted.
He's unmuted, but we can't hear him. Okay.
I think I understand the question. The essence of your question is how many units of nitrogen can I apply in one pass, and per application? And the general answer that I would give to you here is around about 10 plus or minus, but 10 to 15 or so kilos of actual nitrogen per application. But the reality is that the correct answer to that question really depends on the plant, on the size of the canopy, on the size of the leaf area index. So small young seedlings have a very small area of leaf, so they're going to be able to take up a lot less. A larger canopy, closed canopy with a larger leaf area index, of course, that is going to be able to take in a whole lot more. Or the surface area of a maize plant versus a wheat plant, it's also going to be able to take in a whole lot more because of the leaf area. So it really depends on the size of the plant and the canopy cover. And this is why pastures are particularly good in this foliar discussion. And some of you may be aware, but there's some very cool things happening amongst the dairy farmers, who of course are much more higher input and nitrogen users than some of you beef and sheep farmers. And those folks are having some impressive results with using foliar nitrogen and cutting their nitrogen down by as much as 50% through the foliar pathway compared to what they used to use on granular. And that's because, of course, pastures are perfect. They've got a nice leaf area index. You've got permanent leaf cover. So you've got leaf area that can always be taking up, no bare soil in between. So you've got kind of lots of leaf area that could be taking up foliar. So pastures are a model crop, so to speak, that are very, very good at using foliars. And I think that they could be used even more, but it's a little bit different in cropping. And the general answer I give to you is somewhere it's around 10, 12 kgs of actual nitrogen that most farmers seem to be applying per application. But there's give or take above and below that.
Thank you, Joel. So we've got one last question before we release you to go and get some well-earned beers, which is from Paul. And I think it's a good summary question, really. And we all know the answer, but we're going to ask it and get your views anyway. He's put, great talk, Joel, for sure. How important / crucial do you think livestock are within agri-food systems? Great question for the end.
Well, I mean, considering I'm here talking to a Pasture for Life audience.
What you said earlier.
That too, yeah. No, of course, no, I don't need to. I don't need to just say something to appease you all. I firmly believe that animals are really important within our agri-food systems. Of course they are, and there's many layers in which we could attack that answer and answer that, any context in which we could answer that question. And You know, on some more basic level, for me, I liken it to natural ecosystems. I just think, well, out there in the natural systems that we somewhat we somewhat try to mimic and learn from and adapt and apply to agriculture. You know, plants and animals, they always exist together. You know, there's always plants and animals, and I think that in essence, that we see in natural systems that seem to be more ecologically functional, sustainable, etc. That we try to take learnings from that and apply that to agriculture. I think off that premise alone, it's obvious that animals need to be part of the system. And I think that even breaking it down into that classic basic rotation of crops and animals or grazing, you know, we in that post-World War time, we kind of did the specialization thing, and we separated crops and agriculture and livestock, and we specialized, and croppers became croppers and livestock farmers became livestock farmers, and we went down those opposing pathways, and therefore all of the crops started to become very hungry, and we needed fertilizers to feed those. All of the animals started having excess nutrients and manure problems of too much fertility. I mean, you know, when you kind of break it down into those kind of simple analogies, it's very obvious that we kind of need them just in that simple kind of rotation, to kind of use animals to bring fertility, maybe grow crops to then use that fertility and cycle that around. And you know, we could go on and on. Obviously, the grazing systems are harbor much more biodiversity, and biodiversity is a critically important issue. And I know that we're all very obsessed about climate change these days and the amount of carbon and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and climate change is the big impulse. But I take the view actually that biodiversity loss is a much greater concern than climate change, because at least in theory, climate change is reversible. We can draw down, we can recycle some of these greenhouse gases. Whereas biodiversity loss is not reversible. Once things are gone, they're gone. And it's very clear that livestock systems, being less intensive as they are, support much greater biodiversity. And I think that therefore, even also from that point, they have to be very central to our food systems and to the sustainability of our cropping and other productive systems as well.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, a very powerful ending statement. Like, we all knew it, but it's nice to hear it from your good self as well. So really, I'm just going to wrap up and say a huge thanks to Joel taking the time to join us today from Australia. You enjoy those beers afterwards now, Joel, if that's what you're going to do in a moment. Thank you from all of us. Thank you to everybody that's joined today. Look out for the link and head to the YouTube to watch it back if you need to do that, or you'd like to do that. I'm sure you will. I have just put a link in the chat just to highlight Pasture for Life. We've got lots of farming and protected landscapes projects across the country. Follow your nose if you're in a national landscape, because we welcome you to join any of these projects we've got going. So do please take advantage of those that we've got going. But I will leave it there. Enjoy your lunch, enjoy your afternoon, and I think yeah, hopefully see you soon somewhere, and definitely see you in Groundswell, Joel.
You will. Yep.
I'll be doing a few
events. I'll be doing a few events around the UK in June, July. So yeah,
brilliant. Well, keep us in the loop so we can share them out and see you face to face.
Will do. Will do.
So everybody, take care. Bye-bye.